Today's scripture is from the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verse 17 to 23. So she, Ruth, gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about a ephah of barley. She took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked, and said, "The man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours and one of our redeemers." And Ruth the Moabite said, "Beside he said to me, 'You shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest.'" And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young woman, lest in another field you will be assaulted." So she kept close to the young woman of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Praise be to God.
We're about to make this turn in this, we're about the midpoint of this book, and we're about to make a turn in this book to get to chapter 3. And chapter 3 is when we're going to get to this concept called kinsman redeemer. In order for you to understand what that all is about, I need to take you through some biblical teaching. And so today we're going to talk about what is redeeming. What is a redeemer? What is redemption? In the context of the Old Testament, today that word redemption or redeeming is very much rife with Christian theological understanding, and it's not unreasonably so. But before we even get to the fuller Christian meaning, we need to get to the ancient meaning, because actually even a lot of Christians today, I don't think, really have a proper understanding of the term redemption until you have this Old Testament contextual understanding. And it's actually, this is one of the most important things actually in this book of Ruth. Okay, so we're going to tackle that today, and I hope that will be a blessing to you, okay? Let's get into it. Part 1, what is a redeemer? What is a redeemer? Part 2, ancient divine wisdom versus chronological snobbery. I hope we can get to part 2. If I kind of run long on part 1, as you know, sometimes I can do, we might have to just wait on that for a future. But I want to just say a couple little words about divine wisdom and chronological snobbery. In part 3, the ultimate redeemer and the ultimate redemption. Okay? Let's go to part 1. What is a redeemer? Now let me just say very briefly before we get into this, for those of you who have not been tracking with us, we're like jumping right into the middle of this strange book, and I'm going to start unpacking this strange practice and concepts that they did in ancient Israel, and you might just be lost. So just very briefly, what's going on in the book of Ruth, historically, this is the period when Israel is actually very often very wicked and falling into idolatry, and before the establishment of the kingship. And in this period, this book is offered where there's a woman named Ruth, and she is a widow. She's not an Israelite, she is a foreigner, and in the Bible it's very emphasized that she is a Moabite, and the Moabites are an ethnic people that the Israelites hate, and vice versa, because the Moabites had a lot of wicked practices. So her husband was an Israelite, and her mother-in-law is also an Israelite, and then her mother-in-law lost her husband and her 2 sons, which is Ruth's dead husband, and then she moved back to Israel, and then she's in this context, and there is this man named Boaz who helps provide for this family of this widow mother-in-law, Naomi, and this widowed daughter-in-law who is not Israelite. She's a Moabite, and thus she's in a very, very dangerous and precarious situation as I talked about last week, that even the Bible makes very explicit that she could even be liable to assault. She can be treated in horrible ways, as lots of people who don't have belonging. Okay, so that's the background. And so today we're going to get into this. So let's get into it. Let's go to verse 17. So she gleaned in the field. This is Ruth. And she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Okay, so gleaning is the practice by which God commands that people who own the land will not take all. If you leave some of the fruit and some of the produce, don't go back and get it, so that the poor, the fatherless, the widow, and those who are outsiders, the aliens, can receive food. And so that's what she's doing. So she actually picks up a good amount of food. I won't get into what an ephah is, but it's a good amount, okay? Verse 18, and she took it up, went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. This is Naomi. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. Verse 19, and her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she knows that she went out there, and it could be a hard and even dangerous, in a very unjust society. She's a single woman. She is a widow. She's a foreigner. And you're going out there in the midst of all these people who can recognize that you don't belong with them. And it could feel like a humiliating and even a dangerous thing. But she comes back successful because clearly somebody allows her to glean. And so she's very, very happy about that. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Verse 20. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord. Capital L-O-R-D, that's his name, by Yahweh, right? Whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. So just a quick recap on gleaning. If there are people who, all of Israel, if you own land, you're supposed to leave some for the poor, for the desperately poor. And if you do this, God promises a blessing for you. If you don't do this, he promises curse. So she's claiming the promises of God in that covenant. It says, may he be blessed. What? Oh, he's a covenant keeper, a justice doer. Right? So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, the man's name with whom I work is Boaz. And then she said this, after she says this, may he be blessed. Naomi said, I want to say this. He is the one who blesses, who has not forsaken the living or the dead. And I'll get this into a little bit more later. What she's saying is God is not only taking care of us who's alive, but he's actually hasn't forgotten my husband who has died, hasn't forgotten my sons who have died. Through this man, through this form of justice that he's doing, through this practice of gleaning, God hasn't forgotten us. So through Boaz, God hasn't forgotten us. Yahweh has not forgotten us. So here we go. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. Okay? So here we get this really, really important word. And so I'm going to take us now into some understanding of what that is. So what happens in the next chapter, it's a really interesting, and for us moderns, a very weird story, okay? But actually a tremendously amazing story. It would be, I hope you consider it amazing. I keep reading this, and I still think it's amazing ever since, I understand its context. And I'm telling you, in the ancient world, what happens in chapter 3, so you want to come back to church, okay, and find out what happens next, is such an amazing thing, all right? And so they would have even considered it amazing. And it has to do with this question of redeeming or of redemption. Now, in order to do that, I want to try to answer that question from the Bible. What is redemption? What is a redeemer? And in order to do that, let's go to a passage that they were supposed to practice back then, Leviticus chapter 25. And here it goes. So verse 23, 24, and let me just give you the context of chapter 25. If you've never read this, especially if you are a Christian, a lot of people tend to read Leviticus. It's got all these laws. It seems like weird ancient laws, and it can feel like your eyes want to glaze over. Is this relevant anymore? Okay? Some of the principles in this are tremendously important. And in the chapter, so I want to urge you to just go and read that if you want to read something important this week. Leviticus chapter 25. And the context there is actually, it starts off with the practice that God commands called the year of Jubilee. So let me just try to explain this. This is so alien to the 21st century American thinking that it requires some explanation. Here's what it's saying. The Israelites were only supposed to work their land for 6 years. On the 7th year, you don't work your land. You know what that would require? Incredible faith. Because the way you work your land is how you get your food. So if you take a whole year and you don't work your land, you're going to be thinking, are we going to have enough food? You have to trust that God will give you enough for 6 years, that on the 7th year, you can rest. It is a rest for you. So isn't that incredible? You get to work for 6 years, and so you don't have to work so much for 7th year. But you must trust and have faith. That means everybody who works for you, they get to rest too. And, this is important, the land gets to rest too. Actually, people from Africa and like South America, when they read this passage, people who live more like the way these ancient people lived, when they read this, they're like blown away by it. And what they find out is like, there's like science nowadays that find out that if you let the land rest, it'll be a lot more fruitful again in the next 6 years. So it is not just a blessing for the people, it's actually a tremendous, just a way to have sustained riches actually, okay? So the 7th year you rest, and then there's 7 times 7 years, you have 49 years, all right? And then the 50th year, everybody who is in debt. So what happens is if you would go in debt, like how do you make money? In this culture, land and working the land is how you make money. Let me try to just say it a little bit clearly here. Food is money in this culture. What is valuable is your land produces crops, and the land sustains your animal. So the food you eat, the food you trade, the food you sell, and your animals. So like back then, you would go, wow, we're going to kill that cattle, and we're going to have awesome steak tonight. Okay, some of you probably like beef. I do too. They didn't get to eat it nearly as often as we do. But when they saw that cow out there mooing, you know what they also saw it as? That's our money. So more cattle, the stronger the cattle, the bigger the cattle, you are just plain richer. The more crops that come out of the ground, you're richer. So it's your life, it is your food, so that's your life. It's also your wealth. And where does it all come from? It's the land. So the source of your income and wealth and your well-being, everybody knows is land. Okay? So what you do is, if you get into debt, and then you get badly in debt enough, you may have to be sold off into slavery. And you lose your land to work off your debt. And here's the incredible part. Oh my goodness. This is just mind-boggling. It would actually be, I think, amazing if we could do this again. So I know this sounds a little nuts. If America ever became more godly again, it would be great to restore the year of Jubilee. So in that 50th year, you know what happens? All debts are forgiven. So let's say your father was an alcoholic and that's a gambler and blew up his family's wealth. Your family had to sell yourself off into slavery. You, your wife, your kids, Your grandkids are now, you lost your land and you are a slave to somebody else. The 50th year you roll around, you know what happens? All debts are paid. You get to go back to your land. You get your land back, you get your wealth back, you get everything back. That's the year of Jubilee. Okay? Okay, I know that's a lot to say. Now let's pay attention to what it says here. 25 verse 23. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. This is God. Okay? For you are strangers and sojourners with me. That's very interesting. You're like aliens. But you're with me. He's saying this to Israel. It's very interesting. Right? And in all the country you possess, you shall allow a redemption. There it is. So, you think you own this land, it's yours, it's going to be your ancestors, and God does intend it to be your ancestors, but really, all ownership of land is just stewardship of land. A steward is someone who takes care of that which truly belongs to someone else, and God says, I own it. And what happens is, if you blow it, or something really, really bad happens to you, because sometimes it's not always your fault that you blow it, you know. It's not always your fault you drop into poverty. Maybe your father died of disease. Or your father was murdered in a war. Or some terrible accident befell your family, and so you grew into poverty, and then you lost your land. So if the land can be bought back, he's basically saying the land must be able to be bought back. That's called redemption. And when you buy it back to the people who lost it, that's what redeeming is. Are you following me? You following me here? Now let's jump ahead. If you go later in the chapter, you get to this example. He goes through multiple different cases. One of the cases is interesting. It says that if you fall into debt and then you have to work for somebody else who's an Israelite, the Israelite is actually commanded by God, you can't make that person a slave. They're your fellow brother in Israel. You cannot make them a slave. And don't you dare oppress that person. Beat that person, exploit that person. But this is an interesting case. Let's go to verse 47. If a stranger or sojourner, that is an outsider, with you becomes rich, and your brother beside him becomes poor, that is the Israelite. Okay? He's in covenant community. There's somebody else out there who's rich, doesn't really belong to us. Okay? And your brother beside him becomes poor. That means he lives next to the rich outsider. Okay? But he becomes poor. Something bad happened to him. And sells himself to the stranger or sojourner with you, or to a member of the stranger's clan. You guys seeing it? He's in big trouble. He's your fellow Israelite. He had to sell himself, and you know what he's saying? He became a slave. His wife became a slave. His kids became a slave. If he's the head of a clan, got kids, grandchildren, they're all enslaved. And they're all enslaved to a foreigner. Then, after he's sold, he may be redeemed. Do you see that word? One of his brothers may redeem him. So somebody that is an Israelite, hopefully it'd be one of his actual brothers here, can go and pay back the debt, get back the family, free the family from enslavement, and get back the land. And now their land and everything, they're debt-free, and then they can build their life again. Verse 49, or his uncle or his cousin may redeem him, or a close relative from his clan may redeem him, or if he grows rich, he may redeem himself, which is probably a low probability. Okay? So are you seeing this? Verse 50. I'll just try to go through this quickly because this can be a little bit confusing here, but he shall calculate with his buyer from the year when he sold himself to him until the year of Jubilee. And the price of his sale shall vary with the number of years. The time he was with his owner shall be rated as the time of a hired worker. Okay, what does that mean? So, if you fell into enslavement and Jubilee is 20 years away, guess what? In order to redeem that person back and get the land back, it costs more. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? But if Jubilee is closer, it costs less. Right? It costs less. That's basically what it's saying. It's really interesting. So, just a comment about this. In this culture, the way the economic system works, it's not just money is over here and righteousness over here. In our culture, we think being a good person is over here, and it's like totally disconnected from money. In this culture, wealth and belonging, and your wealth is, of course, has to do with land, is very connected to the possibility that you could end up in a really bad place, but you could also be freed from that really bad place. That word is, you'll be redeemed. And there's a very clear cost to it. And I just want to say a little something about this. Well, let me say this first, and then I'll say the next one. Verse 51. If there's still many years left, he shall pay proportionally for his redemption, some of the sale price, his sale price, that means to buy him back into redemption. If there remain but a few years until the year of Jubilee, he shall calculate and pay for his redemption proportion to his years of service. Verse 53. He shall treat him as a worker hired by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee. You see it? Verse 55. For it is to me that the people of Israel are servants. God considers all of them as belonging to me. They are my servants whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. I am Yahweh your God. Can I put it to you that way? And I said to you this in previous weeks if you weren't here. When God says that, he's stamping that command. So I gave you the illustration that I watched this Korean drama where the king has a special stamp. Okay, like in Korean, there's a stamp that says your name on it. And if you put that seal on a document, you're saying this is definitely from me. But when a king does it, it's called a dojang. When his king puts his name there, it better be obeyed. This is what God is saying. He says, I am Yahweh, dojang, boom, you will do this. Right? So, this is the overall practice of redemption, and very much has to do with if your life can end up in huge trouble. Now, I just want to make this comment before I go on to the next passage. You live here in Silicon Valley, and a lot of you are stressed out. It's an extremely expensive place. Some of you have found out how easily your company can get rid of you. Just call it a layoff. And there's a lot. It's hard to actually get a job here right now because there's a lot of talent floating around the city, and so the big name companies here don't have to draw that talent straight out of the colleges. So for some of you college students are having a difficult time finding a job, please don't feel that you're a failure. This is how it plays out. And so, but you worry about these kinds of periods. Why? Because you get to that place, you lose your job, you could lose your house. Your house might have $1 million mortgage on it, and then you can end up destitute. Marriages break apart. Kids could get depressed. You lose your friends. You have to all kinds of things, bad things can happen. And you're worried about it. And honestly, in 21st century America, it's not anywhere as bad as like it was back then. Our brother, Scott, gave us an example of why God commands justice. In the Central American country you are being invited to go to, mom and dad left, the kids are nothing. They're going to die. They got no food. So he's asking you, do you want to go and practice some real biblical justice with me? Right? Because that's the situation here. You end up in a destitute place, you might die, or you may feel that you have to sell yourself off into, like that person says, well, I'll take you in, and that person might decide, I'll just, use you as my slave and work you every single day until you drop dead. Or I find you sexually useful, and that person over there will pay me for me to turn you to prostitute you out to that person over there. And that's the desperation we're talking about in this context. And in a lot of these poor countries around the world, this is happening. It is fairly sad to say a normal thing in the world. So when God makes this redemption and He commands it, it is very, very serious business. And what an incredible thing is to live in a culture where you could drop to the bottom of your society, but you know that God demands that you will have a future. That your wife, your kids might just not end up in prostitution or you murdered, because that's just a normal thing around the world, okay? Now let's get to this one more passage. So here's the passage. It's Deuteronomy 25. It's relevant to the Ruth text. And so here it goes like this. Deuteronomy 25, verse 6. So what happens if a man dies? And so I'll just read it. Verse 6. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name... Oh, wait. Verse 5. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the land is how you get food. The land is how you have wealth. So, why do people want a son? Because you want dudes to work the land. Okay? That's the simple, naked fact of it. It's not fundamentally because the men are more valuable than the women. It's because, like everything about your life, of whether you will eat is dependent on that question. And then on top of that, if your neighbors want to come over here and kidnap your kids, try to violate your women, it's better to have some sons around who will defend your family. So to this day, it's kind of starting to get lost in our culture today. This is why men are expected to be providers and protectors. And I grew up with this. If you grow up to be a man and you don't expect to be a provider or protector, okay, in my generation, you weren't a man. Okay? You're just not a man. There's a lot of boys today, because I don't want to call them men. They grow up and they expect to leech off somebody else. And so they want to be neither a provider nor a protector. Let me tell you something that's bad. You're not a real man. So this is what the situation is. So I know there's a lot of feminist ideology that's upset because, unfortunately, yes, it is wrong when the cultures then begin to think that the men are more valuable than the women, and that is just biblically utterly untrue. That's utterly an offense from the biblical point of view. Okay? So on that point, Christians and feminists, we're agreed, okay? But if you as a feminist just only react, then you're not understanding the context. Okay. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. That's for her protection, okay? Her husband's brother shall go into her, and that is what you think it means, okay? And take her as his wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. Verse 6. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. It's interesting. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. Now, I know this is getting really, really weird, because it is weird, okay? So, a man dies, his wife is a widow, and what was expected is that his brother will now have a child with his sister-in-law, and then when he has a son, that son is actually his brother's son. It's actually not legally his son. You know why? So that this woman and her land, that land will stay in that family and under the name of the brother. That's what it's for. And then you can see not everybody wanted to do this. So you're thinking like, I don't know if I'd want to do this. So you can see people didn't want to do this. So here it is. You go to the gate, that is the central area where everybody gathers, and he says, I don't want to do this. And so the widow can basically tell everybody, he doesn't want to do this. He's not doing his duty to take care of our family. He goes on. Let's go to the next slide. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, do not wish to take her, verse 9, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. That's what it says. So she gets go up to him. You can just try to picture it. There's the brother. He's like, like, sis, like, you're a nice woman, but I don't really want to end up with you. You as my wife. She goes up to him, takes his shoe off, and goes right up to his face while everybody, and just spits right in his face. Okay? And she shall answer and say, so it shall be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. Okay. So, if you get your sandal pulled, now this is going to be really, really relevant when we get to chapter 3. So, it's not the exact same situation because, well, in this case, they're so destitute. So Naomi, the mother-in-law, her husband died. That's Elimelech. Then she had 2 sons. Ruth's 2 sons. If Ruth's husband died and then they came back home, the other guy would have had to do this. Okay? But then he died too. And Ruth came back home, so there's nobody. She's in double bad situation. There is no brother to do this. So that's the situation, okay? And what's the point of this? Is to protect the widow. And if she had children, her children, and that she would actually have a way to have a future, the land, okay? Now, let me just say very briefly a little something about this. Look at part 2. I just want to say a little something briefly about this. Okay, for the sake of time, there's so much to be said. I really wrestle with the time. When am I going to teach what parts out of the book of Ruth? Okay. First thing I want to say is if you're here today and you don't consider yourself a believer of the Bible, and you don't consider yourself like a Christian, well, you might go, "This is the most ridiculous thing I ever heard." Okay. And some of you are going, well, I'm a Christian, and I guess I should apply the Bible, so I'm supposed to marry my sister-in-law? Okay, I want to just time out here. I just want to say a couple things. I know this is really, really odd. There is a wisdom here from God. And what we're doing is we're going to look for this wisdom. I'm not saying I know all of it, okay? But I just want to say a couple things. Number one, do you think the way we handle widows, the fatherless, the poorest, most vulnerable people in our culture, do you think we do a good job of that? Oh, we have this thing called welfare. That'll just take care of them, right? Does that work? Does that work? Have any of you, some of you, probably come from a situation where your father passed away and you ended up in a bad place. Your mom ended up in a bad place. Does that work? So that's the first thing I want to say. Sometimes people see these strange practices, we immediately just dismiss them and just go, whatever, okay? But the first thing I just want to say is maybe God knows something more than we do. That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is, When I was a freshman in college, I grew up being taught the Bible, that the Bible is the infallible Word of God. And since I came to faith in Jesus, I'm like, yeah. But then I went off to college, and you might have heard of the school. It's a little bit up the street from here. I was a freshman at Stanford University. And during my freshman year, I took this historical humanities class, and basically, I picked up the signal real fast. The signal was basically this. Back then, they believed in God. There's all these religions. They had all these strange ancient practices. But then we had this thing called the Enlightenment, and now we don't really need those things anymore. We have this thing called science, and we outgrew all that stuff. So through much of my freshman year, I really had this odd, very uneasy feeling. Am I going to learn something at Stanford which basically blows up my faith? That makes the Bible and Christianity seem like it's irrelevant now. Because modernism, we're moderns now, we outgrew this stuff, and if you still believe in it, it will be nice to you. Today, they're not so nice to you. Christians who believe in it are called bigots and stuff. Back then, they were a lot nicer. My non-Christian friends, when I invite them to church, would just go, I'm glad that's good for you, dude. They were nice about it. But it was a condescending niceness because we heard what was taught in class. Right? And one of the points I want to make to you is it took some time, and I have come to this very, very serious conclusion, is all this modern arrogance is exactly that. It's just really, really bad arrogance. Some people call it chronological snobbery. The later is better. And I won't get into all the arguments for this, but right now, what we do for the weak and the poor is so wretched. It's so pathetic, and we're such a horribly unjust people. I think we actually were a more just country, despite the fact that we're actually, I know you're going to like, somebody, if they hear me say this, can take this out of context, and it'll be up on YouTube. I'll say this. In 1989, I think we were a more just nation, even though we were a more racist nation. We were straight up a more racist nation in 1989, but biblically, I think we were a more just nation in 1989 than today. We're such a more wretched country. You're telling me that we're a better people, we know how to really take care of the poor? So I just want to put this in front of you today, and I want to ask you for a little piece of humility and open-mindedness. And I'll say this one more C before we get to the close of our message, which is this. In the Bible, the money and the relationship in justice are held together. The relationships and the belonging in your community and the money and the source of economics are held together. In America today, your money's your own. You're just on your own. Whatever relational things you have, that's like a separate bucket. Love, money, love and money are just considered two separate buckets. Let me tell you something. I don't think that works very well. In fact, I think it works very, very poorly. And so I want to put that very seed into your mind. Relationship is very important if we're going to be a just people. In fact, relationship is more important than the money. And here, God understands that. And it's partly why we have this practice in the ancient world. We can't reproduce this practice today. The way economics works and stuff today and the relationships work today, I'm not saying I know what the answers are. But somewhere, for justice to return into our society, it's going to take covenantal relationships. Okay? So, I want to get to the last part of my message today. And what I want to do is now take you to this unbelievably important piece of theology. That's the way I'm going to close today, because that's what the book of Ruth is laying down for us. It's not just an interesting story about something that happened to a poor Moabite widow back then. Like if you want to just try to be a little more dramatic about it, think of the Israelites as like white people and think of her as like a black person. That would have been like, just think of like this back then is like Jim Crow South or something like that. That's, now you're getting a feeling of what this must have been like in the book of Ruth. Okay? And that's an extraordinary story, but in the center of the book is a much even deeper meaning, and that is how this book is laying out a theology for all time and all places about redemption. Okay? So let's get to it. Part 3, the ultimate Redeemer and redemption. So before I take you to this passage, all things in the Bible, Jesus said this. This isn't from me. To the latter portion of the Gospel of Luke in chapter 24, after he's risen from the dead, he basically says all of the law and the prophets. That's a generic way of saying the whole Old Testament. The whole Bible, it's about me. And again and again, Christians regularly don't know how to read the Bible in that light. And so I told you one of the important purposes of this series is to teach you how to read the Bible. That's why I'm sharing you, like, the Bible interprets the Bible. You can't just come up with some concept called redemption, just lay it out on people. I'm giving you the Bible's understanding of redemption in its context, and then I'm going to give you another place in the Bible gives you the bigger understanding of redemption in the bigger way and how it points to Jesus. Okay? Now, when you get to certain prophets in the Bible, in the Old Testament, you know what you find out? How God looks at his people. And how God looks at his people is that they, whom he calls she, they are a desperate widow. An abandoned and desperate widow. So let me take you to that. Isaiah chapter 54, verse 4. And this is what God says to Israel. Fear not, for you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth and the reproach of your widowhood. Do you see it? Isaiah is during a period when they've been a wicked nation. They are not covenant keepers. They're not doing justice. And over time, God allows the curse of the covenant, his judgment to come upon them, and then foreigners come in and oppress them and start doing to them, well, you just allowed a bunch of people to just assault, kidnap, murder your children, your wives. Well, now that's what's going to happen to you. But what God now calls, and that's happening to them, and in this context, God calls them, he says, this is a reproach of your widowhood. The reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. Verse 5. For your Maker is your husband. The Lord, capital L-O-R-D, his Yahweh of hosts, is his name. And the Holy One of Israel is your, what does he call himself? Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called. You know what when he looks at his people? He's saying, you are without justice. You allowed yourself to be, actually in other places it gets actually worse. You allowed yourself to be like a prostitute, whoring yourself after other gods. You ran away from me, though you were supposed to be married to me. And you went out there and lost in the world. You were beaten, you were oppressed. Because they prostituted you, they oppressed you, they enslaved you. You became a slave and lost and crushed by the world, crushed by these false gods, crushed by the powers of the world. Silicon Valley, does that sound, Silicon Valley residents, my fellow brothers and sisters, does that sound so weirdly irrelevant to you? Don't you feel that out in the world, they'll kick you around, they'll use you, they'll oppress you, they'll exploit you? And isn't it good that somebody may want to buy you back and love you forever? That's the Redeemer. Verse 6, for Yahweh has called you like a wife deserted and grieved in spirit, like a wife of youth when she is cast off, says your God. You know what our God wants to be? He wants to marry us. We will not be widows, lost, and oppressed in the dangers and enslavement of the world. Will belong to Him. Verse 7, for a brief moment I deserted you, but with great compassion I will gather you. What he means by that is, you were so wicked, I had to let you experience what you deserved. In overflowing anger for a moment, I hid my face from you. That's how he calls his people. But with everlasting love, I will have compassion on you, says Yahweh. I will buy you back, your Redeemer. That's the promise. I want to close with one last passage. Jesus said all these passages refer to Him, right? So I show it to you in the Bible where it makes it very, very explicit. I'm going to take you to Ephesians chapter 5. This is where the Bible teaches marriage. It's actually one of the most important places in the Bible where it explain and understand marriage. So if you ever get taught by me or Pastor Young, we will make you go through this passage if your marriage ends up in trouble, okay? But here's how it ends. Oh my goodness, it's so incredible. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's straight out of the book of Genesis, the definition of marriage. Verse 32, this mystery is profound, and I'm saying that it refers to Christ and the church. Let me close this way. We live in this world, and we regularly feel that we're this close to becoming destitute or made worthless in this world. You want to know why? One of the reasons why young people are so darn anxious today? If you come out of college and you come from a good, intact family, you're probably going to make it. There are a lot of kids who don't even get to college, and they don't come from an intact family, they're probably not going to make it. And even if you do make it, if you talk to your brothers and sisters and your friends, you find out there's very quickly things could go south, and you could end up in a bad place. And that bad place things that you are fearful of, the Bible has a name for that. It's called widowhood. That we as a people would be like a widow. But I want to close with the gospel this way. God sent His Son. You're thinking about this place. You're like, the younger brother, this son is supposed to marry this widow. Maybe he doesn't want to do it. God commanded His one and only Son and said, there is a widow. She's really quite horrible. She's desperately poor. She's idolatrous and very much whorish. But I want you to go and pay her debt. And it will require that you die the death she deserves. You will pay with your blood. But then you will buy her to yourself as your bride. And you will provide for her, protect her, and love her forever and ever. Because, son, you are a redeemer. That's the gospel. That's the gospel. If you live in fear of walking into widowhood destitution in our city, don't ever be afraid. There'll always be jubilee for you because Jesus has paid. He has bought you. You could never be lost. Let's pray. Lord, as we go to your table, we will come forward, and I pray that many know and nobody thinks that we're coming up to do religion. They'll remember that whatever time we're in, our land is like Moab. our land is like a wretched Israel. And it's an unjust time and an unjust place. And that we, as your people, we can very easily fall into widowhood. And that's how you see us. This is the truth of how you see us. The drama of the Redeemer Boaz to marry Ruth is actually not about Ruth and Boaz. It's actually about you, Jesus. To look upon us, a wretched and lost and fearful people, that you would come and buy us back with your blood. Thank you that you would come. You have come. And that nothing could break what you have paid. You have redeemed us. You have bought us back to yourself. And we are forever rich because of you. As we go to your table, may we know that truth. May we bask in that truth and walk with great joy and freedom, because we are no longer enslaved. We no longer belong to the world. We are your bride. In Jesus' name.